The leak of a draft Supreme Court opinion.
The Supreme Court.
The court that dark money built.
Breaking news at the Supreme Court.
The landmark Roe v. Wade case.
A woman's constitutional right to an abortion.
My body, my choice.
And Leonard Leo, who really is responsible for helping Trump fill the Supreme Court.
A Supreme Court decision with dramatic consequences. The justices ruling 5-4.
You look at the decisions like Shelby County that attacked voting rights, and then you look at the dark money cases like Citizens United. It's not just us.
The court is not in order. This is Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, and welcome to Making the Case. Welcome back to our fifth episode of our podcast about the Supreme Court and its ethics calamities. I'm joined again by my House partner, the top Democrat on the House Courts Subcommittee of Judiciary, Hank Johnson, Democrat from Georgia's 4th District. Wonderful to have you back again, Representative.
Proud to be with you, Senator.
And we have Gabe Roth with us. Gabe is the Executive Director of Fix the Court, and he previously managed the Coalition for Court Transparency and has been a very effective advocate for court reform. And he is joined by our last guest, Kedric Payne, who is the Vice President, General Counsel, and Senior Director of Ethics at the Campaign Legal Center. And he cut his teeth on ethics as the Deputy Chief Counsel in the House Office of Congressional Ethics. So we have a great panel here to start with. And let me lead off with the observation that the American people's confidence in the Supreme Court, both as to its integrity and impartiality, is in free fall and has hit historic lows. The court has earned this by demolishing decades-old precedents to deliver major wins for big right-wing donor interests, and its manufacture of flagrantly false facts in its decisions hasn't helped any. And there has been this constant reporting about major ethics violations involving conflicts of interest and secret gifts from partisan right-wing billionaires. It is a mess. Let's briefly summarize some of these ethics crises that the court is facing right now. Gabe, let's start with you. What tops your list of the worst ethics crises the court is facing?
I think the obvious answer here is the right one, which is the largesse that Justice Thomas has been accepting low these many years. We know even with recent reporting from the New York Times that he's been accepting gifts from benefactors going back to the 1980s, and that's continued obviously through the mid to late 90s and 2000s with the lavish gifts and trips on yachts and jets that he's gotten from Harlan Crow and others. And I think, the Justice Alito trip to Alaska, where he was on a private plane of SCOTUS litigant, a hedge fund billionaire named Singer. Look, every justice has skin in the game, but it's has had ethical lapses. There was an AP story that talked about justices using their personal staff to hawk their books and justices attending fundraisers and not really caring about that much about the ethics of that because they're not supposed to be doing that. So each of the justices is a part of this larger ethics story on the one hand. On the other hand, I think the biggest justice in terms of the size of the infraction is Justice Thomas, and you're not gonna beat that.
Well, let me just offer as an alternative, Chief Justice Roberts' failure to clean this up and to respond accordingly, to allow this to persist and to continue. How important do you think his failures have been?
I mean, the story of Chief Justice Roberts is fairly interesting, both because we know from previous Chief Justices that they've had the ability to push for stronger ethics, whether it be Chief Justice Taft in the 1920s, working with the start of the creation of the Judicial Conference that led to some of the ethics rules that we understand today in the Code of Conduct, or even Chief Justice Rehnquist in the 1990s, pushing for certain gift and outside income rules that theoretically the justices could have wiggled out of, and they still do to some extent, but at least saying and stating and having all the justices agree to abide by the rules of the gift rules of the Ethics Reform Act, and also to talk about recusal in a famous 1993 memo. So chief justices in the past have had a strong role of raising the level of ethics at the Supreme Court and across the judiciary as a whole. I think what you have now, and I'm working to try to prove it and haven't quite yet, is that there's a split among the justices as to what the next best steps are. And I think that Chief Justice Roberts does not feel comfortable moving forward with stronger internal ethics rules without all 9 justices on board. There are clearly some justices who want to do more, both from my own reporting and sources, and there are justices that want to do less. But that being said, I think that it's important to put the blame partially on Chief Justice Roberts, as you mentioned, because he should have that power of persuasion by virtue of being the Chief Justice, by virtue of being the head of the Judicial Conference, and by virtue of the fact that his predecessors have successfully pushed for stronger ethics rules throughout the history of the position.
Hey, Gabe, I'm not going to put you on the spot and ask you for your opinion as to which justices are reluctant to impose a code of conduct upon themselves. But I think we know at least one.
I'd spot you 2.
Well, I think it could be as many as 5 or even 6. But by now, a lot of people have heard about one part of the problem raised by these scandals, which is that the Supreme Court is the only federal court in the country without a binding code of ethics. But it's worse than that. A lot of the misconduct that's been reported has flouted laws that Congress has passed to ensure that our government has strong ethics. Kedric, you have extensive experience with government ethics in Congress and the executive branch. What are the laws at issue here, and why are these laws important? How does the Supreme Court's conduct compare to what's allowed in other branches?
Yes, the laws that are at issue here are the requirements for the justices to disclose annually their financial interests. So that includes their income, their assets, their liabilities, and gifts that they receive from third parties. And then you also have the federal law that requires recusal, or at least tells the justices that they should recuse themselves from cases where they have conflicts of interest. And these laws are very important because they help to support the public confidence that the court and the justices on the court are looking out for the public interest and not their own personal financial interests. And when you compare what's going on with the court with the other branches, you do see gaps, because there are these allegations that have been mentioned here where justices are receiving gifts of free travel and they're having real estate transactions that are not disclosed in their annual statements as required. And then you also have recusals that seem to be needed where the justices have apparent conflicts of interest. And the other branches have internal ethics bodies that can enforce these rules and can hold the justices accountable, or at least, hold the public officials accountable. That is, in the executive branch and in the both chambers of Congress. But in the Supreme Court, you don't have an internal ethics body that can advise on ethics rules or investigate allegations, and they just stay out there, and that diminishes the public's trust.
There's nothing that would prevent them from going to the Judicial Conference's either Code of Conduct Committee or Financial Disclosure Committee to ask, right? So there actually is a body they could go to if they wanted to take the trouble and follow the rules.
That's exactly correct. The only thing is, would the justice dispute whether or not the Judicial Conference has the binding authority to tell them how they interpret the law? I do read the law as they do, but you're correct in that the Judicial Conference is there for that reason.
So one of the things about these Supreme Court ethics problems is that many of them have been going on for years. The New York Times first reported on the Clarence Thomas, Harlan Crow jet and yacht travel mess back in 2011. And more, we are seeing additional news come out about more and more billionaires and more secret gifts and a time span reaching back more and more years. I think right now, my count is that we have 6 right-wing billionaires documented to be overseeing the care and feeding just of Justices Thomas and Alito. So this is a really persistent and messy problem. In May, the Senate Judiciary Committee asked Chief Justice Roberts to come and testify about what he's doing to fix these problems, but he flat refused. So if the court won't do something about this mess, then it's got to be up to us in Congress to take care of it. Fortunately, Hank Johnson and I have a bill to clean up this mess, the Supreme Court Ethics Recusal and Transparency Act. Hank, you are my co-author and correspondent on this bill. You want to give the listeners a brief summary of what it would do and how it would help?
We first introduced the Supreme Court Ethics Recusal and Transparency Act in the last term of Congress. It seemed then that we were barking in the night, two lone wolves, and nobody was listening because it was after midnight. But how times have changed and how things have changed, and now we stand on the precipice of being able to mark up the CERT Act in the United States Senate in the Judiciary Committee where you serve. I'm very happy about that. The time has come for the Supreme Court justices to be compelled to promulgate a code of conduct that is applicable to themselves. And closely associated with that ideal, which is set forth in the CERT Act, is the requirement that an independent body be set up to address complaints of ethical lapses that are lodged against Supreme Court justices. Our legislative branch has not fulfilled its responsibility to manage our part of the Article 3 responsibility that Article 1 in the Constitution places upon us. And that is one of the reasons why the court has fallen into such disrepute and disrepair, is because there's been nobody watching. The Fourth Estate, the press, has treated the Supreme Court with kid gloves. The legislative branch has done the same thing, and the result is that our very democracy is threatened. And so, you know, along with a code of conduct and a panel that would be set up to oversee the complaints and to make recommendations on those complaints, you're also going to have strengthened recusal rules that the justices will be required to adhere to. And last but not least, gift and income disclosure requirements will be brought up to par with those that Congress and the executive branch must adhere to. And so the CERT Act is a piece of legislation whose time has come, and I'm proud to be carrying the legislation in the House, and I'm glad that we're getting to this point in the Senate where we're actually going to get the bill marked up. We have a chance of getting it passed out of the Senate.
Out of committee for sure, and we'll see about the Senate. I sure hope so. And for those of us who have been active in this area for a long time, when other people would shake their heads at us and wonder what we were thinking, it's very reassuring to see how the press has moved. And I've got to say, some of the early movers who have really been very formidable and intrepid about the court have been Ruth Marcus, Dahlia Lithwick, Jennifer Rubin, and Linda Greenhouse. So there's now this phalanx of really tough, smart reporters who are digging into these things, and I think it makes us both feel a lot less alone. When Hank and I are working on this bill and people are responding to it, one of the reactions we get is the argument that Congress can't act because separation of powers. And that's an argument that they make without addressing the fact that the Judicial Conference is actually a body that Congress created, and the laws in question were actually passed by Congress. But nevertheless, this argument is a favorite of right-wing voices out to protect the ethics misconduct at the court. I'd also add that the court has uncomplainingly complied with the Judicial Conference and these laws for years. So this is a novel switcheroo of an argument. So, Kedric, let me ask you first. What can Congress properly do, in your view? How significant a restriction on Congress acting on Supreme Court ethics is the separation of powers doctrine?
Congress can absolutely pass ethics laws for the Supreme Court without any separation of powers issues. And we know that because it is well established that the Congress can do that.
We've done it.
It has implemented and passed the laws for the Ethics in Government Act and the recusal rules, which the court complies with. And if you look back at the history of the Ethics in Government Act, you'll see that Chief Justice Warren Burger at the time had no problem with the new financial disclosure rules that were implemented. So I don't see any real argument about a separation of powers issue when it comes to ethics, and it just doesn't hold up from a legal perspective.
Gabe, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I look at this from several different perspectives. One being is, I hate to do this, but I'm going to pull up my favorite Senator Cruz quote on this issue. He said in 2015, "The court's hubris and thirst for power have reached unprecedented levels, and that calls for meaningful action, lest Congress be guilty of acquiescing to this assault on the rule of law." So this idea that, only one party or a few senators or a few representatives want to change the ethics rules of the court is ridiculous. This has been a bipartisan issue that goes beyond either of your tenures in Congress, and has every grounding within Articles 1 and Article 3 of the Constitution. And not only Senator Cruz being a proponent 8 years ago, but last year you passed and Biden signed the Courthouse Ethics and Transparency Act, which is a law that requires the justices to put their financial disclosures online, which they do, and put their stock transactions online, which they do. And that was passed unanimously in the House and the Senate and signed by President Biden. And it was just as much a John Cornyn bill, Republican of Texas, as it was a Chris Coons bill, Democrat of Delaware. So this is an ongoing discussion, and Congressman Johnson is being modest, but his work in the House dates back beyond the latest round of stories about justices' ethics. His office and he and Congressman Nadler worked with Republicans 5 years ago on a bill called the Judiciary Room Act, which passed through the committee that would have required a code of conduct for the Supreme Court. So that, again, is a bipartisan idea, or at least it was 5 years ago, that Article 1 can rein in the ethical behavior of Article 3. And this sort of change of tune, to paraphrase a Justice Thomas quote, Justice Thomas always says, stare decisis is what judges cite when they don't want to think. Separation of powers seems to be what Republicans today are citing when they don't want to act. So, I think that there's a short-sighted nature to some of the opponents' views, and that nature needs to be dispelled.
Also, if your theory is that separation of powers prevents the legislative branch of government from regulating ethics outside the legislative branch of government, and therefore you can't regulate ethics in the judicial branch of government, the logic of that is that we also can't regulate ethics in the executive branch of government, which is another independent branch. And I don't think anybody seriously tries to make that argument.
Well, if we allow Donald Trump to get back in office, I think he might be the first.
That is a very, very good point.
And the court has already addressed this, right? They, to Kedric's point about the Ethics in Government Act, Chief Justice Burger not worrying about the disclosure requirements. Lower court judges actually worried about the Ethics in Government Act disclosure requirements. They sued to have them overturned. They lost in the Fifth Circuit, and the Supreme Court denied review. So the Supreme Court has upheld, via shadow docket cert denial, but still upheld the very requirements that Congress passed upon them.
So where we are right now is we are working to pass the cert bill, the ethics bill, in Congress. We are also working to make sure that these ethics problems are brought very clearly to the attention of the Judicial Conference so that it can take action. It took very effective action against the Scalia trick of soliciting invitations from resort owners and then pretending it was personal hospitality if it was a personal invitation, even if he'd never met the resort owner and even if it was a corporate commercial facility. And they slapped that down pretty hard. So I think there's room for some confidence that with pressure and attention, the Judicial Conference will do its job. And the third piece is continuing to investigate. Every time we see that we don't know the whole story. You know, we thought this was Harlan Crow and jets and yachts and Clarence Thomas, and then it was Harlan Crow and jets and yachts and Clarence Thomas 2.0, and then you had Alito and his $2 jaunt out to Alaska, one billionaire providing the free jet travel and the other providing the free vacation, and now you've got this whole new round of billionaire freebies to Thomas. As I said, I think we're up to 6 billionaires now, and it's not like they're random people. They're connections among those 6 billionaires, and they all connect with Leonard Leo, who's the sort of operative and manipulator of this whole scenario. So there's a lot more to look into. I mean, at the moment, we're kind of at the stage of this being a bad joke, you know. How many billionaires does it take to screw in a Supreme Court justice? But what should we be looking for next? What are the good things to look at in the coming weeks as we continue the investigation to get the full facts of all this mess before the American public?
I would say that what we would look forward to is like this new reporting of how the ethics issues apply to all of the justices, not just those that are considered conservative, but also those who are considered liberal, so that there's no longer this argument that there's a partisan agenda here, and that the laws that are going to improve ethics in the Supreme Court will apply to all the justices, and it is clear that all of the justices at least have the potential of running afoul of what the public expects of their court.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We've known about the violations specifically in the Thomas case for months now. It's been over 2 months since CNN had the report that Thomas was going to update his disclosure, and he hasn't. In the latest round of revelations, it's been several months since the Judicial Conference was brought in, and to my knowledge, we haven't heard from them. Other than that, one of the Committee on Financial Disclosure judges is going to recuse because he, wrote a book report, I think, on My Grandfather's Son, or one of the other Justice Thomas books. So we need to hear from the Judicial Conference and its various committees and see where they're at to be sure that they're moving the ball down the road. The other thing I would look at is sort of the larger picture of, yes, it's this trip, and you guys alluded to it. Yes, it's this trip, and yes, it's this gift, but just imagine this being Congress or your city council or the Department of Homeland Security. We wouldn't stand for it, but it's almost less about the specifics of the trips, and it's more just what is the ethical attitude, what is the moral affect that the justices have regarding their jobs and their responsibilities, and how far from what we uphold to be this best practices in ethics in government they've fallen from that.
Yeah,
it may take a full-scale whole turnover in who's on the court for them to sort of understand that. Hopefully they're getting the message, but by and large, the idea that they can do this with impunity is hopefully being chipped away, and that they start feeling some shame. I mean, I think that's the other aspect, is that a lot, Justices Thomas and Alito clearly feel no shame, but hopefully the justices start feeling shame and realize that they are not just, representing a few billionaires, but they're representing 330 million of us.
And how coordinated is this whole thing? Is it a series of random gifts that have no connection to one another or no purpose behind them, or is there more to this? And you can't really draw those connection lines until you have all the facts. Let me offer to my friend and colleague Hank Johnston closing words, and then we will take us out.
Thank you, Senator. We have a problem with low ethical standards by some Supreme Court justices that has caused the entire institution of the judiciary to come under the harsh scrutiny of a lot of people who have lost confidence in government. And the courts have been the last bastion of politicization in the minds of some people. They wanted to reserve the court from being a political animal, but the low ethical standards and the recent spate of cases that eschew precedent and that are based on factual scenarios that have turned out to be inaccurate. All of this has just decreased public confidence in our democracy. And with respect to the judicial branch, we have so many great, dutiful, honest, competent judges. Many of them get a chance to serve on the judicial conference, and they see what is going on. They understand how the United States Supreme Court justices are holding themselves above the ethical standards that the lower court judges must follow. And so I have a lot of confidence that members of the judicial conference will at some point stand up and become more vocal in their meetings about the need for Supreme Court justices to come down from the lofty perch that they put themselves on and be subject to the same rules of conduct that all other federal judges must abide by. I'll paraphrase Chief Justice Roberts in his confirmation speech before the Senate. He talked a lot about calling balls and strikes. If we can get the Supreme Court to return to that ideal, it's going to be important for the elevation of public confidence and trust that is needed in the Supreme Court and in the judicial branch. I'm looking forward to good things with passage out of committee of the CERT Act. Sheldon, congratulations to you on your fine work in bringing us to this point.
Well, you're right, Hank. There is no better witness to justices violating the ethics rules than judges who every day have to follow and live within the ethics rules. And I hope that the judicial branch will step up and take a role in cleaning up the court. Thank you very much to Gabe Roth and to Kedric Payne. Thank you to my friend and co-host Hank Johnston. This concludes episode 5 of Making the Case. See you at the next one.